Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Ellen Fanning. Coming up, after a drubbing at the polls, the coalition ushers in a new era of leadership under Peter Dutton and David Littleproud. Mike Cannon-Brookes, Victoria, says Australia's biggest emitter, AGL, abandons its plan to demerge. We explain. And as China's diplomatic push in the Pacific hits a hurdle, we'll hear from a former regional leader about what Australia needs to do to win over local leaders. Joining me on the panel tonight, Vice Chair of the New South Wales National Party, Wendy Machin. Great to see you.
Thank you.
Political and international editor at the Sydney Morning Herald, Peter Hartcher. Thanks for coming in.
Pleasure, Wendy. You're Ellen, you're Wendy. Sorry.
Yes, we'll keep it that way.
I'll straighten it out.
Yeah. President of the Australian South Sea Islanders, Port Jackson and City of Sydney Councillor, Emelda Davis. Busy day. Thanks for making time, Emelda. And in Canberra tonight, Research Fellow and Director of the Pacific Institute at the ANU, George Carter. G'day, George. Wonderful to see you. And you can join us on Twitter using the hashtag #TheDrum, and we're on Facebook. The new federal leadership of the coalition has taken shape today with the Liberal and National Party rooms voting this morning in Canberra. Peter Dutton was elected unopposed as the Liberal Party's new leader, with former Environment Minister Susan Lee appointed deputy. And following their electoral defeat last week, the new leader of the opposition has set a clear direction for his party.
We won't be Labor light. We'll propose strong policy to make the lives of Australians better and to provide more security to them. Our policies will be squarely aimed at the forgotten Australians in the suburbs across regional Australia, the families and small businesses whose lot the Labor Party will have made more difficult. Under my leadership, the Liberal Party will be true to our values that have seen us win successive elections over the course of the last quarter of a century.
However, the new deputy leader did seek to address some of the criticism the party has faced when it comes to women voters.
I will continue to be a strong voice for women. We know that we didn't receive the support of all women at the last election. And my message to the women of Australia is, we hear you, we heard you, we're listening, we're talking, and we are determined to earn back your trust and your faith.
Meanwhile, the Nationals chose not to re-elect former leader Barnaby Joyce. The party room instead chose Queensland MP David Littleproud and first-term Senator Perrin Davey as deputy.
And this is not about the National Party lurching left or lurching right. It's using common sense and being in the sensible centre. That's where you win elections, not chasing extremities. And the National Party proved that when we signed up to net zero by 2050. And if we didn't sign up to that, let me just say, every Australian, Treasury modelling would have shown that capital markets had already factored in nearly up to a 3% increase in your mortgages, and your commodity prices would have gone down. So I couldn't look my people in the eye and say we can't be part of a global community.
And while rejection might hurt for some, the outgoing Nationals leader insists he's taking it all in his stride.
Well, I suppose you think I'm sad. Not really. I gave every ounce of my energy to make sure I looked after the people of regional Australia, the people in the small family businesses, the people in the weatherboard 9, those people on the farms, making sure that we drove the investments to hopefully take their standard of living ahead.
Emelda, let's start with you. This program has a Pacific flavour to it. Your family has a long history in Australia as well. When you think of Peter Dutton, often people in the Pacific talk about his unfortunate joke about rising sea levels. How well remembered is that?
Thanks so much, Ellen. And you know, this is very well remembered because it's a continuum of the amnesia that Australia has when it comes to a Pacific slave trade that occurred here in the 1800s. And to think that our people are still suffering some 175 years later in relation to, being the forgotten people of this nation, and now our Pacific Island homes are challenged with climate change. So that comment that Peter made some years ago still sits quite firmly in our psyche.
And to what extent, George, members of the Pacific community, you are here in Australia, you call Tonga home as well, looking to see how genuine all political parties in Australia are about the challenge of real action on climate change.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to start that my home is actually Samoa.
So apologies.
No. First, the comments, I still recall this back in 2015. I think it was post-Pacific Island Forum where Dutton made the speech. And, it has been replayed over in media and social media. And it really was one of those cases that epitomizes the last government. Looking forward to the new government here in Australia, especially with now Labor and what Penny Wong calls the new era of engagement in the Pacific. Many are looking to not only how Labor will bring together not only a consensus or crossing the line for greater climate action, but also what both national and the coalition policies will be in terms of climate change. Will there be a change to bring about this climate action?
And it was interesting, Wendy, to hear David Littleproud speaking so very clearly after, of course, Matt Canavan famously said, the LNP senator during the election campaign, that net zero was dead. And a moderate Liberal MP today who lost his seat, Trent Zimmerman, said that was a killer moment for moderate Liberals. How difficult is it going to be for him to maintain that line that this is where the Nationals are on this? Because the federal Nationals have been so far behind where you New South Wales Nationals
Well, certainly New South Wales and the state coalition are making great gains, as are all the states. They're actually, doing really well and in many states ahead of the targets that they'd set some years ago. So they're doing a lot of the heavy lifting at the state level, which is helping the nation. I think that David sent some clear signals today in terms of what he said and how he said it and who he had with him about perhaps a bit of a generational change in the National Party. And you see a couple of younger leaders there coming out to lead the party at the federal level, talking about climate change. David has done that for some time, and he referred in his press conference to the initiatives that he rolled out in terms of incentives for farmers to get involved in carbon storage, carbon farming. And that was, a world first done by the Nats, as he said. So it's quite a broad church. When people often mistake the National Party and think they're all like the loudest mouths, they're not. And Matt Canavan probably is one of the louder voices, but that doesn't mean he's necessarily the most representative voice. And when he said that in the federal election, a lot of people went, oh no. It wasn't helpful in an election campaign, and we saw the impact of that in the city, in those seats like North Sydney, where I was handing out on election day, and climate was really the topic of the day. So I think, the task for David and his leadership team is probably a bit of a policy reset. That's not taking a long way from where it was. I think it's probably articulating better what the Nats' position is and how we're going to take that forward and where the opportunities are there.
Well, and I think the moderate Liberals have reflected that Australians just didn't think the National Party was fair dinkum. I mean, when Canavan came out and said net zero is dead, they went, aha, that's what's really going on. They've signed up to it, but they don't really believe it. I mean, I guess that's the task for him. But at the same time, he's saying, Peter, there should be action on climate change, and he's left no doubt about that. But at the same time, he says, yeah, but the government doesn't have a role in delivering that, which will be news to the National Farmers Federation. And then you look over at Peter Dutton, who's the leader of the Liberal Party, and he says, oh, we're estranged from big business. The CEOs are closer to other parties. So you've got the head of the Nats out of step with the National Farmers Federation, the head of the Libs out of step with big business. Have we fallen down a rabbit hole?
Well, if it's a rabbit hole, it's one that they've been in, the coalition's been in for years. And, both some of the Nats and some of the Liberals are quite comfortable in that rabbit hole. In an alternative reality, it's a fantasy about the state of the planet, and it's a fantasy about where most of Australia is. However, some seats, and this is the critical part, some seats, particularly in Queensland, these guys still see climate and coal as their differentiating political persona and won't readily abandon it. Matt Canavan is not going to stop advocating for coal. Barnaby Joyce, who agrees with Matt Canavan, in fact, Canavan is an understudy of Barnaby's. Barnaby will now be liberated to talk about this because he's no longer leader, if he wishes to. They think it's worked for them, regardless of what's happened in the rest of Australia.
Yet Michelle Landry, who's a Queenslander, was, when she arrived in Canberra this week saying, we've got to start talking about this. We've got to get, on board. We've got to have policies that represent broader Australia. So, she's a Queenslander and she's saying we've got to acknowledge climate change and do something about it. So, that's to my point that there are some quite loud, outspoken voices in the National Party, but it doesn't always mean they are the majority view. It's challenging.
Just finally to Emelda on this, I know that you do work with First Nations Australians constituents as well. Peter Dutton said he had regrets today, that it was a mistake to walk out of the Parliament when Kevin Rudd was making an apology to the stolen generations, that's First Nations children taken from their parents, on the basis that at the time he thought, unless all the injustices and all the inequalities are dealt with, it's just symbolic. What do you make of that?
Look, I think Dutton has made quite a few mistakes over the years, and I hope he's, all I can say is that I hope he's reflecting on these actions, because they send a loud and clear message, and that was evident in our election.
Tech billionaire Mike Cannon-Brookes has pulled off a corporate coup, which he says will help propel Australia to its goal of achieving net zero carbon emissions by 2050. He has stopped AGL Energy, which is the nation's biggest carbon polluter, from splitting into two separate companies. Now, the company's management decided last year that creating these two separate companies to focus on moving away from coal-fired power generation and into renewables was the way to go. But Mike Cannon-Brookes argued that keeping the company as one unit would make the transition quicker and easier. The Drum's David Taylor explains.
AGL Energy powers millions of homes across the country, providing gas and electricity. For decades, it's done that by burning coal at one of its many power stations. But it's also meant it's achieved the status of becoming Australia's biggest fossil fuels emitter and the single largest contributor to carbon emissions. It's widely understood the solution to that problem is closing the coal-fired power stations and instead using renewable energy like wind farms to generate the power to produce electricity. The question is, how do you go about that? In March last year, the Board of Directors decided to split the company in two. Axel Energy to work on the renewable transition and squeezing every last cent out of AGL's remaining power stations, and AGL Australia to focus on the retail and power supply arm. Tech billionaire Mike Cannon-Brookes disagreed with that idea, believing the company's transfer to renewable power generation would be faster if it stayed in one piece.
The new government, with the Labor Party's plans, makes the demerger maths very hard to see how it makes any sense. We would argue it didn't make a lot of sense anyway in the first place. I know the company can do the maths the same way we can.
His first move was just to try to take over the whole company by buying it, so he could call the shots. He first tried this in February, but was rejected. He tried again in March, upping his offer, but was rejected again. Then he decided to spend $654 million buying an 11.28% stake in the company, and in the process becoming its biggest shareholder. That gave him a platform to convince other shareholders to vote against the Board of Directors' plan to split the company in two, which today he achieved.
We're doing the things that we said we were going to go do. We've said what we're going to do for 3 weeks, and every single time we've done what we said, so we'll continue to do that.
It's also led to the departure of AGL's Chief Executive, Graham Hunt, and Chairman Peter Dutton will leave the company.
For more on this, we're joined by Global Head of Strategy at Bloomberg New Energy Finance, Kobad Bhavnagri. Thanks for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
This has been a fascinating kind of corporate soap opera, hasn't it, Kobad? Start at the beginning. Just really start at the beginning for us, because Audi comes on his white horse, or maybe it's a black horse, depending on your point of view, and says, right, AGL, 8% of Australians' emissions, that's more than every single car on the road, more than all our domestic and international aviation, and we're going to get AGL to end coal-fired power generation in basically a decade. So this was a bold ambition that he had.
Yes, I mean, it is a bold ambition. And if we sort of wind this back to, okay, how did it start? we have to go back a fair bit. We have to really go back to sort of 2010 and the early part of the 2010s when AGL went on a bit of a buying spree. It started to buy a lot of coal generators, which were being sold for a song by state governments in New South Wales, and also acquired a big one down in Victoria. And that really transformed the company from being not much of an electricity generator, having a little bit but not a huge footprint, to being the biggest electricity generator in Australia, and therefore also Australia's biggest carbon emitter. And bringing those big coal-fired power stations on board changed the company, and was, many would argue, a pretty short-sighted move. I mean, it worked well for a couple of years when electricity market prices were rising. AGL obviously reaped the benefits of having a big portfolio of generators in there. But at around 2017 came a turning point where the electricity market price started to come down because of all these renewables coming into the system, which put downward pressure on prices. And that coincided, of course, with the Paris Climate Agreement, where the world and financiers really started to take climate change seriously, and so began to question the value and see a terminal date to those coal-fired power stations. It really started to sort of turn sour for AGL, and their share price for the last 5 years has sort of been in terminal decline almost. It has dropped 70% since its peak in 2017, and then it was last year, as it was outlined in David Taylor's package, that the board said, okay, we've got to do something about this, and then they announced this demerger plan.
Okay, and so just really briefly from me, Kobad, the tension was between Cannon-Brookes and other big capital organisations on his side saying we need a faster shift away from coal-fired power. I mean, that was their big push. And the company saying, look, we'll split it in half and that'll be the way to get us to renewables. But it was seen as actually trying to wring every last dollar out of fossil fuels in this country. Is it fair to say that as of tonight, Cannon-Brookes won and the company lost?
Well, I would put it as Cannon-Brookes won and the current management of the company lost. So I think the way that certainly Cannon-Brookes and some other players have interpreted what AGL's strategy in splitting their company was definitely as trying to maximise the value of those coal generators, but also not really position itself for the future. Right? And this is sort of one of the core problems that companies face in the energy transition, is that it's hard to have an eye to the future if you've still got one eye on the past, right? So if you've got these big fossil fuel assets, it's hard to start to build a different business which often runs counter to those interests to position the company for the future. Yeah. And AGL were struggling with that, as many companies around the world have too. And the demerger plan was basically a bit of financial engineering, where they were saying, okay, we recognise we've got a problem with these coal-fired power stations, so we're going to spin them out, but we're going to contract with that spin-off company to agree to buy all the power for 5 years. Yeah. So we're not really, like, are we getting rid of them? Well, yes maybe and no. Yes, so it was a bit of optics, really. Yeah. It was a bit of financial optics and engineering, which meant that, the conviction to really transform and become a new energy company wasn't, arguably wasn't there.
Let me turn to George Carter on this. I mean, you do a lot of work on how this sort of diplomacy happens, how the art of persuasion happens. What do you think of Cannon-Brookes saying, righto, who's the biggest emitter in Australia? Let's go there. Let's go there.
Yeah, so my research, when I look into climate change negotiations, I follow sort of the work of Pacific negotiators, but where I find in there are what you know as climate champions. So when Paris came about, champions like Enele, Sopoaga, and other leaders like Tony de Brume sort of set forth in creating or influencing other leaders to have the Paris Agreement, a voluntary system, that it wasn't just about states providing a wholesale signal that there must be change, but it called upon businesses, civil society, to not only set targets, but create about urgent change. Now, this is an example of a climate champion, through a business a millionaire that is able to force or accelerate change, not only in Australian business, but it's sending signals right across in terms of supply chain and renewable energy. And it's an action that should be applauded, that climate champions are not just diplomatic leaders, politicians or activists, but also business leaders.
And in the end, Wendy, I mean, they couldn't get 75% of the shareholders to agree with the AGL board and management's prescription on how to move forward. And a big part of that was the industry super fund HESTA, who represent health and community service workers. And that's the employers and the unions and independent directors together saying, we invest for the long-term interests of our members, and that interest is best served by decarbonisation.
Yeah, they are a reasonable sized shareholder. I come in at 3% or something like that. I think the issue is really interesting in a number of ways. It's an interesting one from sort of corporate governance, strategy, and how you get from here to there. Plus the bigger problem of how do you transition from the old-fashioned power, coal-fired power, to new power, maintain jobs, maintain shareholder value because it has shareholders. So I guess one of the things they've had an eye to is returns to shareholders, who presumably they are super fund members. So they want a good return on their money, but at the same time they've got to change the business, remarkably to try and deliver the carbon outcome that people are after. So it's really complex. And you throw a billionaire into the mix who's articulate, charismatic, wealthy, and he's had a big victory today.
It's a big fight, Emelda, too, over how quickly you think this transition is really going to happen.
Look, I think there's a lot of young, innovative leaders coming through, and what I do love about Mike Brooks is that he's, the climate activist. So, it's always important to agitate industries and just see, what surfaces. So I think, it's going to be really progressive and effective in moving forward.
And Peter, he seems to think, this is a guy who knows how to make money. He's a billionaire. He seems to think that he can very rapidly, that if he was able to take over the company, which he didn't succeed, but he succeeded today, that it's really possible to build enormous amounts of renewable energy to replace coal-fired power quite quickly, like within the decade. He seems to think that is doable. That's his business brain.
Well, he's got experience, so he's not only a software entrepreneur. Among his other interests is this thing called Sun Cable, which has built, or is building, the world's biggest solar farm in the Northern Territory, and then via cable sending the electricity from that to Singapore. It's going to supply 15% of Singapore's annual electricity needs. It's a $20 billion plus project that they're currently building. So he's already doing it. He's part of that investment. He knows it can be done. Other countries have already done it and are doing it. It's eminently doable. What he's doing is just taking a company that, we were talking before about the coalition. The coalition government made a short-term bet under Tony Abbott and Barnaby Joyce that coal was the future. And the rest of the party was mistaken in thinking that was a long-term play. It wasn't. AGL, wrong side of history, same deal. They thought it was a permanent fixture. It's not. It's a temporary thing. And now they're having trouble making the transition. And Mike Cannon-Brookes is going to line up and help them with it.
So how much control has he got, Kobad? I mean, he did want to take over and privatise the whole company. He hasn't succeeded in that. But the chair, the managing director, and another two members of the board have walked out today in the Australian Financial Reviews, but they're basically throwing their hands up saying, OK, somebody figure out what's next. Can he dictate the pace of the decarbonisation effort?
Yeah, so look, I think Mike Cannon-Brookes has won the argument, and I would stress that the argument was not won on environmental grounds; it was one on business grounds. So if you look at the campaign that Mike Cannon-Brookes waged, it was very much about finance, corporate strategy and performance. It was saying that, look, this is a company which has leadership which doesn't get it, which is not forward-leaning, which is stuck in the past and is making bad decisions. And look, that argument has won the day in this circumstance. The bar was lower because he only needed to get 25% of the vote, but he's won that argument. And so I think that's really a powerful indicator that whoever is formulating AGL's new strategy now, which Cannon-Brookes will have influence on, but won't be dictating, that they're really going to have to, adopt a similar posture to say, okay, no, we've got to lean into the energy transition. We've got to figure out, okay, how do we provide our customers with as much renewable energy as possible, and how do we solve the problems that they will have in a new energy age, which are things like, hey, I've got solar on my roof, but how do I get a battery in there, and how do I get an electric vehicle in the garage, and who's going to install the plug for it, and all this stuff. There's a whole bunch of business opportunities in the energy transition for the whole economy, but let alone an energy retailer. And Mike Cannon-Brookes' argument was that, hey, you've got to go for that. And that argument has won. And I think it will be pretty tough for new management of AGL to come around and say, oh, actually, no, we still want to go slow on that. Because, frankly, AGL have been, sort of wishy-washy, haven't had a clear strategy on energy transition for the last decade. They've tried a bunch of things, stopped them, etc. And their share price has been hammered. The market doesn't like it.
Yeah. Fascinating to see. Fascinating corporate play. Cannon-Brookes has described it as one of the biggest decarbonisation projects on earth. Emelda, you wanted to have a final word?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just, and I'd be also interested to see just how effective these organisations are working with, Aboriginal carbon foundations and Indigenous perspectives on, eliminating these emissions and putting forward these, building sustainability as well in collaboration with First Nations communities.
Because sustainability is more than just decarbonisation, is the point, yeah.
That's right.
Kobad Bhavnagri, thanks so very much for your time. He's the Global Head of Strategy at Bloomberg New Energy Finance. You are watching The Drum, and with me on the panel, Vice Chair of the New South Wales National Party, Wendy Machin, Political and International Editor at the Sydney Morning Herald, Peter Hartcher, President of Australian South Sea Islanders, Port Jackson and City of Sydney Councillor Emelda Davis, and in Canberra tonight, Research Fellow and Director of the Pacific Institute at ANU, George Carter. China's efforts to strike a region-wide trade and security pact with Pacific Island leaders hit a hurdle today, with leaders refusing to sign up to the deal. A crucial meeting between China's Foreign Minister and a number of his Pacific Island counterparts took place earlier today in Fiji. China's Foreign Minister Wang arrived in the country yesterday after visiting the Solomon Islands, Kiribati and Samoa as part of an 8-country tour. The proposed deal included Chinese and Pacific cooperation on policing, cybersecurity, fisheries and disaster relief. But the Fijian Prime Minister says global uncertainty led him to oppose the pact.
Geopolitical point scoring means less than little to anyone whose community is slipping beneath the rising seas. Climate impacts have intensified, and Russia's war in Ukraine has sent food, fuel and freight prices skyrocketing. We cannot retreat from the field of multilateralism in the face of this multiple crises. Indeed, global cooperation and international law have never mattered more.
And it was the issue of climate change that overshadowed much of the visit by Australia's new Foreign Minister to Fiji last week. After meeting with Penny Wong over the weekend, Fiji's Prime Minister tweeted this.
Fiji is not in anyone's backyard. We are part of a Pacific family. And our greatest concern isn't geopolitics, it's climate change. In that spirit, I had a wonderful meeting with Foreign Minister Senator Wong to strengthen our Vuvale partnership with Australia.
Let's start with you, George. How are you reading this? Like, it's tempting to say, OK, China went all out to get this agreement and this group of Pacific Island nations said no thanks, and Penny Wong's gone in there and it looks pretty good. The problem with Beijing resolved. Is that how you read it?
Not necessarily. Well, it's important to put into context what has happened in the last couple of weeks, well, especially the last week, in terms of China visiting, foreign minister visiting the 8 countries. In a way, he's showing his respect by visiting these 8 countries. There wasn't necessarily anything new, rather a reaffirmation of policies or initiatives that were agreed to before COVID. The optics here, though, is that you have a foreign minister visiting a country like Kiribati that's still under COVID lockdown, a foreign minister visiting the first ever female prime minister of Samoa, and in fact, this is the first ever international leader that they've met face to face. So in a way, China is not only reaffirming its economic, diplomatic ties, but also showing that respect. However, when it came to the area of trying to form some form of regional or multilateral agreement, this is where it missed out. While it's been a great opportunity for Pacific countries to show their, reflect and sort of tell forth their key messages, which are climate change, COVID, it's important that China needs to also understand the Pacific way of doing things. Part of that is inclusivity, consensus, transparency, especially in the case of media. So it's also good lessons for China, but it certainly will not be the last.
That's a fascinating perspective. What do you think, Peter, particularly that talk of consensus? There seemed to be a vibe coming out of Suva today that some countries wanted to have a look at that sweeping regional economic and security deal, but others didn't. And as George says, where there's no consensus, they just hit the brakes a little bit and slow down.
Well, it's divisive. The relations with China have now thrown a new level of division into the politics internally in a bunch of Pacific countries, and now you see it at the leaders' level between countries as well, where some leaders are more keen to get involved at a deeper level with China than others. But look, whatever has happened today, in fact, Ellen, I talked to Penny Wong this morning. I wanted to hear what her experience was last week, where she visited the Pacific 4 days into the life of the new government, in fact. She said that whatever was going to happen today with Wang and the Pacific leaders, that she said we can expect China will press its interests in the Pacific harder than ever, and that Australia needs to compete. Australia, to quote her, Australia has our work cut out for it.
And to what extent was she holding her breath about this meeting with Wang getting together in Suva with all these regional leaders to sit down and say, look, do you want money and engagement on security, on policing, on maritime, on cyber security, on training your police, on fisheries? To what extent was there not alarm, but real concern in Australia that this was a key moment?
Well, I think I'd make 2 points. From what Penny Wong said to me this morning, she said she found a good reception in the Pacific, that leaders were pleased, enthusiastic to have a government with a more active climate policy and pleased to have the more active engagement. The previous Foreign Minister, Maurice Payne, in 3 years had only made 2 trips into the Pacific and visited only 3 countries. It was COVID constrained, but it wasn't much of an effort. Penny Wong said she found an enthusiastic reception, so she was feeling pretty good about her initial foray, and she'll be back again, as will Anthony Albanese, with the Pacific Islands Forum leaders meeting in July. But I don't think she has any illusions about the scale of the problem and scale of the challenge from China. It's 8 years since Xi Jinping flew into the region, flew into Fiji, and said, we are going to bring, I think he said, we're going to offer you a ride on the development freight train, express train of China. And we're here. We're going to make a big push, and that push remains. It's a key strategic priority for China, and whatever obstacles they hit, as they've hit today, they'll work around them, they'll work over them, they'll work through them and beyond them.
Emelda, what perhaps do you think that Beijing understands about the region that Australia doesn't, or has forgotten, or never did?
Oh, look, I really do think that with China being of, I guess, deep cultural understanding in how you approach and respect other cultures. I think, Solomons, Vanuatu, so on, we have a deep appreciation for customary practice and cultural governance, and political diplomacy is really important for Pacific nations especially, and you see in the manner in which many leaders and heads of mission that I've worked with in the past conduct themselves, incredibly gracious. So I wouldn't underestimate what's just occurred. I think Penny is the perfect diplomat to head up these negotiations, but don't underestimate the savvy of our Pacific nations. So, Australia has a long history, and I think Australia tends to forget we have a long history. Australia and Vanuatu in particular, as Australian South Sea Islanders, are the largest Vanuatu diaspora in this country. And if we are truly talking about Pacific neighbours, Pacific Step Up, a number of other initiatives that have been rolled out in previous years, there's still not a strong foundation. We need to have a more grassroots people at the table to speak through these issues from a lived experience. You need to work with the people, as the Australian people have, demonstrated in this recent election. If you're going to overstep or forget the people, you're not going to get, progress in a country. So I think it's really important that we take heed of what's occurring right now in the political climate and empower the people, and don't underestimate the power of the people. So, it's we've got issues with Pacific labour mobility, etc., and we've worked for the last decade in remedying some of those challenges, but still there's a great lack of understanding around the cultural necessary framework in speaking to each other, and respect for memorandums of understanding, and making sure that we build capacity for both countries. It's not just a one-way street here, and people are reaching out to support, people's economies. So what's Australia really going to do? We need affirmative action.
Yeah, that word respect keeps coming up again and again, George. Respect and listening. There's a kind of a feeling that goes, well, when Nui has a cyclone, when Vanuatu has a cyclone, Australians are there, as if China has just arrived this minute in the Pacific and turned up. Now, you yourself have some Chinese heritage. These links with China go way, way back. Describe that and tell me about the influence of that.
Yes, so in terms of Chinese populations within the Pacific, you have sort of third and fourth generation who are not only children or descendants of those who came as indentured laborers during the colonial plantations in the 1800s and 1900s, but also explorers during those time. And these populations have assimilated and joined the rest of the local societies. But then more recent in terms of with the increase in economic activity from China, you have a new wave of Chinese migrants who are not only small, medium enterprise business owners, they're also part and parcel of the construction companies that are, who are fulfilling some of these infrastructure programs by China and the rest of the Pacific. They have had a struggle in terms of living amongst societies within the Pacific, and have been, in some places, sources of tension. Part of this is not understanding cultural differences. But, this is a reality and dynamic of Pacific society today.
Fascinating. An important moment.
Can I just add?
Yes, indeed.
Sorry.
Go on.
Sorry, but yeah, and I do agree, George, and it's also a reality of Australian government. I mean, the challenges we have with First Nations Australians, we've got issues around climate change for the Torres Strait as we speak, still considered a part of our Pacific or Melanesian regions. So we've got to start unpacking some of this and really having people who have the knowledge, the know-how, and the consistent understanding, because every time a government changes, we have to go out and re-educate. And this is the downfall. And that's why you get these issues surfacing all the time, because of the lack of trust that's built between, the countries.
Yeah. Well, an important moment in Australia's relations in the region came at the Pacific Islands Forum held in Tuvalu back in 2019. Climate change was at the top of the agenda, but during negotiations on the forum's communique, a blueprint used for policy making in the region, the Australian delegation was reported to have pushed to remove any references to coal or a strategy for net zero by 2050. Now, the eventual communique, which was passed, did call for an immediate global ban on the construction of new coal-fired power plants and coal mines, but with the qualification that not all countries supported it. After the meeting, many Pacific leaders spoke of their disappointment with Australia. Among them was the host and chair of the meeting, Tuvalu's Prime Minister, Enele Sopoaga, who said he was stunned by Scott Morrison's behaviour. He's now no longer the Prime Minister, but he told me earlier of the need to reset the relationship and suggested that Australia's new Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, should have travelled more widely on her first trip to the Pacific region.
We are not the backdoor backyard of Australia, with all due respect. Pacific Island nations are independent sovereign countries. They are in the United Nations. And I think this needs to be translated into proper, respectful engagement with island nations. Visiting one country will not fix the problem. In fact, it will further create some sort of feelings amongst the other Pacific Island countries.
You've described Beijing's efforts to increase its presence in the Pacific region by saying the camel is already in the tent. What do you mean by that?
10 years ago, we didn't have that because our partnership with Australia was strong. Australia and Pacific Island countries, including my own, were engaged in tangible economic and social development projects, and they are visible in the island nations. The visibility of Australia was there. There was a lapse and suddenly an absence of that partnerships of concrete physical presence of Australia in Tuvalu and many other countries. And I think that's when we allowed an opportunity for the camel, to put its influence, and in came big interventions by China in the Pacific, as well as trying to put its nose in the Pacific Island Leaders Forum. And now I think the 2 feet of the camel are already in.
Sure, but Beijing doesn't have a great record on climate change itself. How much is this actually about money?
It's not a secret that there is a checkbook diplomacy ongoing, but also at the same time, the island countries, particularly the most vulnerable island countries, have been calling out that the main security issue is climate change. We are already seeing the tug of war. It's no longer a cold war. We are entering already, I think, a hot war now. With these island countries, 14 votes in the United Nations can be swayed and persuaded to take up positions that may be quite adverse and counter-effective to Pacific stability and peace in our region in the Pacific.
What does Australia do now, not just in terms of emissions reductions, but in relation to providing funds for adaptation for small island states through the Green Climate Fund?
It was a great slap on the face when Australia decided to move out of the GCF, simply following President Trump's attitude and policy, I believe. That was a great slap on the face of Pacific Island countries. We were, in fact, very, very disappointed. But at the same time, maintained not honoring its greenhouse gas emission reductions targets, not to allow temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. I think the voices of the Pacific on these things have been very, very clear.
Pacific Island nations have been lobbying for years now for Australia to stop opening new and expanded coal mines and new coal-fired power stations. Now, as of last year, we have 72 such projects, which would double our coal and gas production on one estimate. How much harder does that make it to reset the relationship?
The thing is this, the more coal mining and greens that would create greenhouse gas emissions, the more we in the islands have to adapt to the impacts of climate change. We just have to keep that equation in mind. We cannot say, all right, we give the Pacific Island countries $2.7 billion, while domestically in Australia, policies are to open more coal mining. Australia, I encourage them to seriously look at what needs to be done in reducing its domestic greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah, former Tuvalu Prime Minister there, Enele Sopoaga. Wendy, truth time. Australia, under the coalition, I guess, has dropped the ball on the Pacific.
I think that's probably not unreasonable. They are important nations. Every now and again, you see island nations where people are now becoming refugees because the water is taking away their homes. And regrettably, I don't think we've seen enough of that. It's shocking when you do see it, but we probably haven't seen enough of that. They are important neighbours to us. They are important relationships. And I guess we are copying some justifiable criticism from those nations. And we are seeing others come in and occupy the space. And even the nations in question can realise the risks potentially associated with that. So I think it's going to be an interesting few years, I guess, in diplomatic relations between those nations.
Oh, I suppose it was at the time that Tony Abbott cut foreign aid, Scott Morrison decided not to make any further contributions to the Green Climate Fund, which was created to support the efforts of developing countries to respond to the challenge of climate change. I mean, at least some Australians must have said to themselves, well, good, spend money here. Thinking about national security and our role in the region, is that thinking a mistake now?
So you mean
drive down
money,
foreign aid,
spend money here,
spend money in Australia, not overseas.
Oh, in Australia. Look, I don't think it's not about not spending. I mean, we do spend money overseas,
but that was cut. That was cut very significantly, right?
It's not correct to say we don't spend it, and I guess it's a government's right to decide how and when they'll spend it. So it'll be interesting to see what the new government does in that space. I think we do all have a responsibility to provide support. Whether that's in aid for green type projects or more general infrastructure. Yes, I think that's the role of every country. I guess where some of the resistance comes from, and it is probably partly domestic politics again, there's this interesting interplay between domestic and international politics, and it's almost impossible to untangle them when you talk about climate change. I suppose some people would argue that Australia by itself, if we stop building any power stations, any new gas projects, what impact does that have on the world? It's quite small. So I guess that's where some people say, well, OK, this is just the perception. We take a big hit, we lose jobs, or we have to, invest in transitioning. We're not quite sure how we're going to do that and how successful it might be, but we need to do it. But what is the global impact of that? And it's really small because as a nation, we're a very small emitter.
Emelda, what do you think hearing that?
I just go back to the same mantra in that we have a relationship with the Pacific. These are our neighbours, these are our families. We cannot ignore what's happening here. If we are a smaller emitter, who's creating those largest emissions and why? Because we're importing the products from those countries. So, it's very challenging, but we need to build better people-to-people relationships. Otherwise, we're going to have a disaster on our hands.
And just to Wendy's point, right, about we don't hear enough about it. I was doing some research on Vanuatu, and I think I have his name right, Ralph Regenvanu, right, who used to be the foreign minister, now he's the opposition leader, speaks very powerfully on this and says, look, I think what you don't understand in Australia is that Vanuatu is in a permanent state of emergency. Cyclone Pam comes through, not only are people killed and the population displaced, but 90% of the buildings are wiped out. And then 5 years later, another cyclone comes through and you end up with poverty traps, kids who never go back to school. Just take the time to explain to me what it means to be in a permanent state of climate emergency, which Vanuatu is in now.
Well, it's constant trauma, isn't it? It's devastation. And then you've got, programs that are, needing the men from Vanuatu to pick our fruit. And that's not addressing climate change. It's adding to the challenges that we're facing because people don't even have a moment because they're trying to rebuild their communities and they're taken advantage of in some ways, in many ways, because, they have to go out and try and recreate a whole lifestyle that they've lost. And it's quite distressing. With Cyclone Pam and Cyclone Winston, we, ACPJ, our organisation, assisted and the Australian community in providing a significant amount of national disaster resources. But we can't keep contributing to that capacity because it's just, everyone's depleted. And the communities are really suffering, and there's no real capacity building and supporting these Pacific Island nations in rebuilding, and we need affirmative action. We need the support and the injection of financial support. It's not just about, you've got to cut out, I think, the middleman. It's got to be a government-to-government program and discussion because you've got all these agencies that are going in there and you're paying for the administration just to keep them, afloat over there in those economies. So, there's got to be smarter ways of working. But the only way you're going to resolve that is if you work with the people and the organisations. Yes, we have, our government representatives of the highest order, but lived experience and what's going on for the people, by the people, is going to be the solution for the people.
Talk to the same point, George. Ralph Regenvanu talks about poverty traps, the idea of that one cyclone comes through, it wipes out the schools. Some kids never go to school again. It wipes out the fields and the impact on subsistence agriculture, particularly for women. Talk to me about what it means.
First, I want to sort of start and say that Australia and the Pacific Islands share the same geography, so same climatic system. But the impacts are different and also the extent of these disasters. So, you have impacts like cyclones. We do have cyclone season every year. What we're seeing more and more and what the science is saying is more intense Category 5 cyclones. We're seeing more flooding as well as ocean acidification. So what is happening right now is countries like Vanuatu, Fiji, Solomon Islands, Tonga are not only facing Category 5 cyclones once every 10 years, it's almost 2 or 3 a year. And we've seen in Vanuatu probably 1 every year. This causes a lot of stress on communities who have to rebuild. There's displacement that happens every time there's a cyclone, migration within, from areas that were impacted out and then moving back in. There's water salination, water insecurity because of sea level rise in places like Marshall Islands as well as Tuvalu.
And you're talking there about freshwater, limitations on freshwater because the sea level table is rising and contaminating the fresh water.
That's correct. And so there are very different impacts all across the Pacific, and it's getting more and more intense and causes stress on local communities. Furthermore, for governments, having to, seek out funding to try and rebuild, this goes to the generosity of countries like Australia, China, United States in providing humanitarian assistance. But then at the same time, countries like Tuvalu will then have to, or Vanuatu would have to ask for more debt, for more loans to rebuild. And if you're having costs like around $200 million or $300 million every year, this is the stress on the economy itself. And so it's not just individuals or communities, but statewide. And so this is why countries like Vanuatu, Marshall Islands have called for climate emergency. We've seen it in the Kainaki 2 and Nandi Bay Declaration. The region are calling for, we are in climate crisis. So it's not just a rhetoric. It's as Wanda was saying, it's a lived reality. And it's something that it's not just something that Australia, but globally that we should all be looking at and trying to address together.
It's amazing, Peter, to think that, that Ralph can say of Vanuatu, and this a couple of years ago, look, they can actually price in the cost of the devastation of climate change to their annual budget at US $48 million. And as Wendy was indicating just then to me, it suddenly makes some sense that if China turns up with deep pockets, you go, well, hello. And at the same time, Albanese has said coal exports could go beyond 2050. He will not oppose the opening of new coal mines, and nobody's talking about the Green Climate Fund in the new government.
Well, I'd make a point here, Ellen, that Australia, obviously, there are absolutes and then there are relativities compared to China. The absolute is that Australia, as the dominant power in the Pacific, has a responsibility, moral but also geopolitical, to assist the Pacific Islands with all of their problems, and there are many. The Pacific Islands are some of the poorest countries on the planet. Australia's development assistance has been negligent ever since the 1970s, when Australia gave PNG independence. We've been incredibly negligent, and only China has brought Australia's attention back, and that's shameful. But it's back, and Australia needs to do more. But then there's the relativities. So let's be real here. Australia remains the dominant aid provider to the region. I think it's 1.4 billion last year. The Labor's policy is to add another $500 million Australian dollars a year over the next 4 years. So there will be more development aid to the Pacific, and that dwarfs the amount that China is spending. Where China spends in the Pacific that Australia can't compete is putting bribes in politicians' bank accounts. That's the reality, and that's happening and has happened. And we know that from other politicians and public figures and reporting in the South Pacific. So that's one. And the other one is on climate change and the real buffheadedness in Australian diplomacy here. I mean, Australia is a country that, regardless of how poor the targets were, was reducing its emissions and now is going to accelerate the pace of reducing emissions under the new government. China is increasing its emissions and has a specific policy commitment to increase their emissions until the year 2030. They're going to be increasing, not decreasing. So China is no friend of the Pacific or the world in terms of cutting emissions.
We're nearly out of time.
That was the point I was going to make, the irony of this checkbook diplomacy, which one of the risks is loading up some of these nations with debt, which, as George said, would be just, putting problem on problem. And yet their record on climate, on emissions is terrible. So it's just a failure, I guess, as you say, that there's been a vacuum perhaps left there and China has come in, possibly with not the best of intentions.
George, I'm going to do this to you. You're a new panellist, but just give me 30 seconds. What's your advice? Listening, trust, what's the words?
Australia has come out and wants to be a climate champion working with the Pacific. I think the part of that is for Australia to also push the other G20 economies. Speaking with the Pacific in this regard, while Pacific has been successful in terms of moral diplomacy global, there's still that group that includes China and India, and this is where Australia can really come through.
Wonderful, you did it. Thank you so much for that. That's all we have time for. Thanks to Wendy Machin, Peter Hartcher, our two new panellists, Emelda Davis and George Carter. Wonderful to hear your voices. Jeremy Fernandez is with you tomorrow night. Have a great evening. Good night to you.